really nice to be able to come out and see real people. It's fabulous to have an excuse to wear a full suit, not just the top half of it. Although I did discover it doesn't fit me quite as well as it used to. I've lost some weight, so that's not too bad. This is a chance to talk about one of the pillars of the £1 million challenge that was discussed. Sorry, £1 billion challenge that was discussed by others this morning. Looking at vacant and derelict land, it's a piece of work that's still, despite the work we've put on, in very early stages, and a real opportunity to try and use your professional and geographical knowledge to fire some ideas in that will help us to move to the next stage. So on that basis, there are not many worked up ideas here. There's an awful lot of context and such like. So we want to talk about vacant and derelict land. In Scotland, that has a very specific set of definitions. So the Vacant and Derelict Land Survey, which is an annual reporting process back to government by local authorities, says that vacant land is land that's previously been developed and is designated without physical constraint as being suitable for redevelopment. So that's the easy stuff, although some of it has been around for a very long time. For a site to be derelict, its previous use is preventing it from being redeveloped in some way. That may be about contamination, it may be about presence of structures on site, but it is hampered from redeveloping and hampered from naturalising by its past. So this is very much about our post-industrial heritage. Scotland, the 2020 survey shows that we have just short of 3,500 vacant and derelict sites. So that's about 11,500 hectares. That's the same as 267D. Or as I worked this out the other day, about 2/3 of the area of the city of Glasgow. So it's a significant wasted resource. Of these, about 1,500 sites are urban and derelict. So they're within the towns and cities, and they are the most challenging of those sites. And terrifyingly, 60% of them have been like that for at least 20 years. Many of them for nearer 50, 60 or 70 years, in fact. You'll see the distributions here. The left-hand graph is by area. The right-hand graph is by number of sites. And what that actually shows you is that there are some very big sites in Highland and some very big sites in East Ayrshire, primarily the old coalfields. But that actually the intensity of the impact is far more focused in on the Greater Glasgow area. And in fact, if you look at the 20 years plus, the dusty sites as they're known, derelict, urban, since 2000 or earlier. That's the... Of those, the vast majority of them are clustered in Glasgow and North Lanarkshire. This is an issue about just transition. It's an issue about fairness. If you live in the 10% most affluent communities in Scotland, you have about 11% chance of having a vacant and derelict land site nearby. If you live in the 10% most deprived, that figure is 5 times higher. For some parts of Glasgow, everybody lives within 500 metres of a vacant and derelict land site. So this is very much a social and environmental justice issue as well as an opportunity. This October 2020, the Vacant Derelict Land Task Force, ably facilitated by the Land Commission, produced a report for Scottish Government. It recognised that vacant and derelict land had major impacts economically, socially and environmentally on Scotland. And it proposed mechanisms to accelerate the pace of change. The figures are dropping in Scotland, but one of my colleagues calculated that at the current rate of drop, it would take us just over 300 years to get rid of it. So it needs to be accelerated dramatically. And it looked at how we use data, how we use policy, how we use legislation, how we use funding, how we stop sites coming onto the register, because this is not a static, and crucially how we target legacy. And within that section, there was a recognition that particularly for these persistent sites, we should be looking at a green infrastructure-driven, nature-based solutions-driven set of changes, putting urban space alongside low-carbon, community-led initiatives. This was quite a strong set of recommendations developed by an incredibly diverse task force, which had private, public, voluntary sector and academics in the mix, and who, to a person at the end of the process, said that the report was better than they expected it to be, because we all started to see each other's perspectives expanding our own. The Scottish Government responded very quickly on this and actually announced an additional £50 million commitment over 5 years, which isn't a lot given the scale of the problem, but it's significantly more than we had. And crucially, from my perspective, it was designed in such a way that it is supposed to create a pipeline. So the amount of money per year increases across the 5 years, allowing ideas that aren't quite ready to spend time in the first years getting to an end point. So it's a very important step forward. But it's not enough. If we look at developing vacant and derelict land across the whole area, not just those priority urban sites, there are options to address climate change. We can look at climate mitigation. We can look to, certainly in the Ayrshire coalfields and the work that Forest and Land Scotland mentioned in the video earlier, significant driver on carbon sequestration. But we've also got some major climate adaptation opportunities around water management particularly. And as I've said already, the just transition component is absolutely key. Absolutely delighted to do an event with the Minister last week where she was driving just transition as the key, not carbon. And I thought that was a really important place to be. It's the first time I've ever rewritten my presentation because the politician who spoke before me said the right things, not the wrong things. There's also an opportunity to look at nature loss. Certain sites that are properly located in the right place can have a major impact on ecological coherence across an area. There's certainly an opportunity to bring people into contact with nature with all the well-being benefits that delivers. So we can look at the twin crises as lenses towards the vacant derelict land. It's a real opportunity in urban areas to generate usable community green space, which I think COVID proved to us quite why that was so important. But equally to look at things like urban farming, food growing, vertical farming, having environmental benefits that might actually be about taking impacts from areas that are more fragile into areas where actually we can do something new and exciting. And the one that my organisation, Green Action Trust, which is a third sector partner, we specialise in what we refer to as environmental regeneration, so looking at degraded landscapes and places and using environment as a way of delivering benefits across social and economic agendas. There's an opportunity to look at these sites as development sites, which is actually what most of them are viewed as, but to find developments that are better placed for environmental impact than the standard is. So we pre-install the blue-green infrastructure. We ensure that we have the right active travel links and connections. So it's not just about purely environmental or purely green end solutions by any means. We're looking for environmental benefits, social benefits, and economic benefits. So vacant and derelict land, I would argue, offers a significant but challenging opportunity for sustainable net zero development, particularly in those communities who are most at risk and least responsible in Scotland for the problems. And that nature-based solutions should be at the heart of realising this opportunity, even when the end product is something which is commercial or residential or mixed use or whatever, that we should have nature-based solutions built into the heart of that. We have an opportunity here to create a form of retrofitting that doesn't rely on the fact that we have to get around the existing buildings because there aren't any on these sites. And crucially, we should be able to generate economic benefits which generate returns on investment, which is where we're interested in a hybrid funding model, which we don't yet understand. This is the point where Shona Glenn should have stepped in, but unfortunately Shona couldn't be there, so I'm going to pretend I know more about the Clyde mission than I actually do. The Clyde mission is a really interesting perspective. It was kick-started by Scottish Government. It's a partnership of public, private and academic sectors. It's looking at a place-based, mission-led programme focused on the River Clyde, which, as you'll have seen from the maps, puts it right in the heart of the biggest sets of problems around vacant derelict land. And the idea is that the Clyde should itself become an engine for sustainable growth and inclusive growth for Glasgow, for the region and for Scotland. And there are these 5 missions within the overall Clyde mission. The one that obviously interests us is the second one, using vacant and derelict land for the benefit of the economy, the environment and communities. But I would argue actually by doing that you deliver across the other 4 quite automatically. So they are very, very intertwined. It's a corridor a kilometre wide that runs down the Clyde from west of the city of Glasgow to the sea, taking in all the remains of the shipbuilding industry and the various other bits of riverside industrial area. And contrasting dramatically with what has happened where the river's edge has been developed so far, which is incredibly corporate grey and impermeable, I would argue. But if you look at it, there are 263 vacant and derelict land sites within the footprint of the mission, spread across 7 local authorities. The footprint also overlies the Clyde Gateway, or parts of the Clyde Gateway, which is one of the major regeneration vehicles in the west of Scotland, and has a fantastic track record of looking at vacant and derelict land differently. It's also just become the first net zero business district in Scotland, or an aspiration to become. So you can see that even here that there are clusters around Glasgow, the city itself. The other thing that's important and useful to bear in mind with this, when we talk about the issues around investment, is that if you have a look at those sites, there's a massive tail of smaller ones. There are very few big sites. There are very few of the sites that Forestry and Land Scotland are targeting for woodland creation, for example. Most of these sites are less than 5 hectares in area, and close by other land uses. And that sets us an interesting challenge about how you scale up from very, very small granularity sites into something that might attract an investment portfolio to attach to it. Across those sites, the local development plans and economic development strategies of the various local authorities have identified key uses for them across this graphing. The reason I put this in is that those two are very obviously related to natural capital and nature-based solutions. So one's around green space, one's about water management. They're the ready go-to. But actually, I would argue that in this part, particularly in the more dense urban parts of the area, the housing land and commercial land opportunities are probably the ones we want to be targeting. It's about doing that different, better, and in a sustainable, biodiverse way. So really, we still, if we take those 4, we are covering the vast majority of the sites that are available, or we could be. So the workshop for today, and I'm going to leave this slide up and shut up in a minute, which is great. I don't normally get through things quickly, so I tend to get distract myself with my own slides. There are 3 questions that we're trying to get our heads around at the moment to take an idea which was in the route map through to something we could start to discuss with potential investors and markets. So the first one is, given that vacant and derelict land could deliver in many ways around the biodiversity, natural capital, nature-based solutions, you know, it could be purely environmental, it could be environment as a way of making something else better. What range of sites and end uses seem the most sensible to package in, you know, from your experience? So what sort of things would make a good, interesting package to potential investors? So that's reach, maybe that's the first R. The second one is returns. So, you know, so what should we be considering when we start to pull this together as being a sensible balance of returns? You know, are we looking for things that are relatively quick or relatively long? Where would that be? Is it purely about economic return, a financial return, or is it about corporate CSR and all sorts of other things where people might find values that are not necessarily the most direct ones? And we have had very, very early discussions with the National Investment Bank about whether this is the sort of area they would be willing to listen to. So that's a very, very early stage discussion. So it's not, here we have an idea, would you be interested if we ever came to you with an idea? It's rather like the way I proposed to my wife, actually, and now think about it. On the romantic level, it was after about 3 weeks, and we got married a lot longer. But if ever we felt like we still felt like we might, would you consider? It was about where it got to. There is definitely a role here for the public sector to act as a cornerstone funder to allow private investment to feel that the risk was minimised. What we'd like to know a bit more about is from your experience, what that might look like. Every time we've gone and looked at an international example, there's a public funder in there somewhere using some mechanism to make it work. But really, we want to use the Miro board that's about to be shared with you by someone. If you're on the online community, and if you're in the room, we'll work our way through those 3 questions, really just to get a feel for where we might structure this moving forward. So that is how early in the day we are. We know we want to do it. We know it's hybrid. We know it's multifunctional. That's about as far as we've got. So any thoughts would be really, really helpful. And I'm going to hand over to Kath, who's actually going to facilitate this workshop session. I'm going to sit down.
Hello, welcome. I'm just going to facilitate the next half hour as we look at these 3 questions. So hello to everybody who's joining us on Zoom. Hello to everybody here. As Deryck has said, we really need to tap into your expertise and your experience to help look at vacant and derelict land opportunities in Scotland. Obviously, vacant and derelict land opportunities elsewhere as well, but this is an excellent example of the opportunity and what we can actually achieve. And so we'll work through these 3 questions over the next half hour. So those of you who are on Zoom, hopefully you have got the link to the Miro board. You'll see if in the top left-hand corner there is a pointer icon. That's your critical place to go. Using that and clicking in that you can move post-it notes over onto your Miro board. And you can then also move the Miro board by clicking on that and using the hand to move the Miro board around. And we have, I hope, Rory on Zoom, who is monitoring that Miro board. And Rory, I will be coming to you to, if you've got any key points that people have put on their sticky notes on the Miro board to join into this conversation. And then Hannah Redmond is kindly going to monitor the chat on the Miro board, and I'll be coming to you, Hannah, as well, so that we have a conversation with everybody who's attending at the moment. So a quick question from Hannah.
One extra instruction for the colleagues online. The link is in the chat. It appears to be about Riverwoods, which is what we did yesterday, but go right. Scroll right, and you'll get to the right Miro for today. Thanks, Kath.
No problem at all. Okay, so I will endeavour to mix the conversation here with those joining us on Zoom. So, as Deryck was saying, we do have public sector support. We have that 50 million Scottish Government support funding over a period of 5 years that can act as a cornerstone in terms of the funding of essentially bringing vacant and derelict land back into productive use. But with that focus on nature-based solutions being incorporated into that to deliver those climate change benefits, the help with the kind of biodiversity loss, and deliver a whole raft of other benefits as well, social, economic and environmental. So we'll start with the first question. So thinking about that opportunity with Glasgow as that example, what range of sites and end uses would be most attractive? And Deryck did mention that a lot of these sites in the Glasgow region are small sites. So there's, can we bundle those up and so on? So I'll open it to the floor here. Any thoughts on the range of sites and then also the end uses that would be most attractive? Now we're talking about attracting in that private investment alongside the public funding. So would anybody like to start with some comments?
We're allowed to ask a question.
Yes, absolutely. Have we got a microphone? Hannah.
Thank you. I was just wondering how much work has gone into assessing the sort of individual business models for each of these sites and what the commercial models look like. And then the next part of that question is basically overlaying what those different business models are for each of the sites and actually effectively looking at a pipeline of what those different sites and the actual business models start to sort of overlap.
That's
because I think that will start to drive a lot of your answers.
you preempted my last slide, which is coming up then. No, the reason for using the Clyde mission footprint as the example here is that what we're currently working on a potential pipeline portfolio type assessment for that. So you're going from your 3,500 down to your 14,000, 3,500 down to your 1,400 down to 260. So that process is underway for that one region. It's an immensely complex landholding in the sense that you have sites where multiple sites are owned by the same organisation, but they don't know they own them, through to single sites that are owned by multiple organisations, some of whom don't even exist anymore. And it's and most of them have aspirational use attached to them. But some of those aspirational uses have been there. You know, some of these things have been identified as housing stock for 60 years.
Because I guess, given your sort of finite amount of money
Yeah.
and the practical limitations, at some point you'll have to create that long list and prioritise against your objectives,
Yeah.
and that will drive your limitations as to what that financial trade-off will be, and indeed what your type of investors will be.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say the 50 million is additional funding. There is an existing underlying vacant and derelict land fund that funds standard regeneration solutions, if that's not too damning a phrase. So it's focused on get that land off the register and into some use, which includes naturalising into biodiverse habitat, oddly enough. The 50 million is very much about a net zero driven but multifactorial agenda, and I sit on the panel that decides on the successful bids, and in terms of the ones that were funded and the ones that were nearly funded, there's some quite fascinating differences in how people were approaching it. Everything from net zero housing developments through to opening up an adjacent site to become a net zero industrial. So there were some quite interesting mindsets that were being developed there. And that's kind of where we've got to at the moment is, you know, how widely do we cast the selection net, if you like. And you're probably right. I mean, it does need... The challenge is you can do it on a site-by-site basis, but is it possible to do it on a macro scale downwards as well? And I think that's where we're trying to tease out at the moment, is could we actually start to identify the criteria against we assess from a macro investment scale rather from a site need scale?
Yeah.
Because the two at some point will meet in the middle.
Yeah. I do have more questions, but otherwise I'll keep hogging it.
We can come back to you. Thank you. I'll go to Hannah. Is there any comments or...
No, everyone's busy popping
Excellent.
their notes on the board.
Good. So Rory, hope you can hear me. If you would like to mention any key points coming out from the Miro board, that would be great. Hello, Rory, can you hear me?
Hello everyone. I hope you can hear me.
It works.
Great stuff. Please, you can hear me. Okay, yeah, I'm just looking at the Miro board. It's fair to say most comments so far have focused on the site selection. So on that, we have sort of banner headline would be the need to develop a sort of hybrid financing model. A key point that comes through is the need to sort of aggregate sites to create synergies. And we've already heard this from Deryck. So we're talking about economic, social, environmental benefits, not just tackling carbon. So we could have green on one site that also supports commerce on another could be neighbourhood regeneration. The need ultimately to produce a portfolio of sites that delivers a wide range of purposes and benefits. And someone else asks, are there similar vacant and derelict land initiatives in some other countries? And if so, you know, what are the opportunities for us to learn from these examples? And maybe just a final question for the room, how might we prioritise sites for vertical farming?
Thank you, Rory. Some really good points there, and identifying some of the potential end uses for those sites. I don't know if anybody has thoughts here on what would be attractive for private investment. Any comments in the room?
Yeah, hi. My name's David Watt. I'm the chairman of the Scottish Forum in Natural Capital. I'm sitting here getting, I would say angry is the wrong word, but frustrated is probably the right word. Because as you may have noticed on LinkedIn or whatever this morning, First Minister announced some money for vertical farming. There's a significant amount of money for the cities deals. I could go in with a long list of things, and we really need to start joining this up so we actually get these funds all pointing in the same direction and all spending the money in the same way, and then we'll have an impact in these sites. It's extremely frustrating, and that's just the public aspect of the money. And until that is joined up bluntly, the private sector is not going to come into, excuse the French, what's basically a bugger's muddle. It really is a mess. We need to join these things up. It's an immense frustration to me. Equally, the vertical farming is the one thing I was going to suggest immediately. I think there's also a massive opportunity to bring education back to people, as somebody who also chairs a college, albeit on the other side of the country, who, fortunately or unfortunately, is about to build a significant building. But we need to start downsizing the size of our educational buildings and take education to the people. And that could be on a much more localised basis across a lot of these derelict sites all across Scotland. Anyway, that's one of my bugbears. Several of my bugbears at one time.
Thank you.
And it wasn't a question. It wasn't a question so much as just a couple of suggestions of places to look. One was L&G have done a fair amount of regeneration work throughout the UK in Salford that may provide some examples. Edmund de Rothschild has the Ginkgo Fund that is a brownfield redevelopment fund that's maybe interesting, and that has an ESG metric. And then you'll know more about this than I do, the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. Is that something worth looking at? Yeah, but I just was thinking of ideas, but you know more about that one than I do. You think no? Okay. Right. But the Ginkgo one might be, they've done, but again, it will be commercial use and housing, which may not tie up with everything you wanted, but just some ideas.
Thank you. Some lots of ideas on land uses, and I know that from SEPA's perspective, we're very interested in vacant derelict land from things like the flood risk management aspects, blue-green infrastructure, and those opportunities. So you can see, a lot of potential with these pieces of what are very valuable, underused pieces of land. So moving on to the second question. So we had to think about the range of sites, how we might bundle those up, some of the end uses, the prioritisation process, which is obviously critical. But thinking about that, thoughts on what type and scale of returns would investors seek if they were investing in parcels of land, bundles of land? Thoughts on that from the room.
I have a question. It's not related to the investors. It's because you say that the main solution is through NBS, nature-based solution. And what is the difference with if you have any industrial land and you want to regenerate it and build houses or any commercial sites and so on? What's the difference between what can be done with sustainable energy, with, solar panels and so on, managing waters and so on? Do you call that NBS? Or if it's not that, what will you do more to be able to call that NBS? Because it's done what I said before in sustainable cities and so on, but it's not exactly an NBS. So what is it for you, an NBS, in these cases? Because I didn't get the point, or perhaps I didn't listen well, but because that's an interesting point to motivate investors.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. It's one that we probably haven't fully answered, and oddly enough, these questions all start to work back to the original point, which we probably have to look on a site-by-site basis. I think there's two elements in those types of developments that we could argue we're heading towards NBS. One is an acknowledgement that the vast majority of development that's done in the UK doesn't get close to sustainable city quality. So any step in that direction would be better than none. There's quite a few of these areas where you've got clusters of sites where approaching one or two key elements or key parcels of land with a purely nature-based solution approach, probably around water management, probably around flood risk management, would actually make the rest of that land holding developable in whatever means. And that certainly was the case with at least one project we looked at last year in the last round of funding, where effectively one intervention would have meant that the adjacent sites were then developable for a solution which would have been net zero targeted in terms of the technology that was used, but actually probably wouldn't have had a nature-based solution component. But actually the key to the lock that was stopping it working was actually the lack of that nature-based solution which in that case was about water management. There are others too. It's an interesting middle ground. I do quite a lot of work on sustainable urbanism, and it's relatively easy to work out how you could apply sustainable city concepts to new. The challenge is always retrofit, and certainly Glasgow did an assessment that a few years ago that reckoned that 80% of the people who will live in Glasgow in 2050 will live in buildings and on streets that already exist. So retrofit is always a challenge. The vacant urban sites, because of the way they're structured across the urban areas, often are the pockets that could allow you to retrofit in the sorts of solutions we're interested in. And that might then make the rest of a community more investable for other reasons. So it's a fairly complex set of interactions, which is always hard to describe to people. Not in this setting, because people in this setting understand what we're talking about. When you get away from that into a more traditional setting, it can be quite difficult to bottom that out.
So my name's Zoe Laird from Highlands Islands Enterprise, and I've just been trying to think through the answers to your questions, which are pretty hard, so well set. But in answer to one of your first questions, I think you've answered it yourself, which is land ownership will continue to be a problem for any investor. Nobody's going to invest when you're going to have to go through all that challenge of working out who's going to agree to what. So there's one area. But as you were just talking now, I wanted to mention a company called, I think, Aquaterra, who do nature-based platforms, if you like, that would sit on the river, that would soak up floodwaters, that might make your other land ready for other investment, and to group perhaps your sites together, looking at which bit of the land needs a nature-based solution like that to mitigate floodwaters, to make the rest of the land viable, would be a way of looking at it, sort of a miniature catchment scale activity. And then I thought, for me, one of the bigger questions was, what's the context of the land? What's around it? What's going on there? Is it housing? Is it commercial? Is it industrial? And depending on the context, you might find that you might be able to attract some investment into heat systems, which could supply whatever that contextual environment is, because again, those kind of need scale and land, but often it isn't there, so it could be a nice fit.
Yep.
So just a couple of ideas.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Can I just comment on that very briefly?
Yes, yes, go ahead, Deryck.
It's interesting. In a previous role, I worked entirely in urban green space, and one of the things I find quite interesting is there have been quite deep discussions about district heating systems using green space as locations for ground source heat. There have been some very detailed analyses in Edinburgh of urban green space with the potential for flood attenuation. So, where would you channel the water? When you come to Glasgow and away from Edinburgh, because Edinburgh has very little vacant and derelict land, and you start to play the Glasgow thing, the first question is, which bits of vacant and derelict land would actually perform that function better? And I think you're absolutely right. I think there are renewables, and particularly the heat-based renewable options, that might be very, very attractive in certain parts of the very urban areas.
One more question here, and then we'll move to Hannah and to Rory.
Just to comment on that, because a lot of what we're talking about, especially when we're talking about in investment around packaging and the kind of making the cross portfolio connections, if that's what you could call it, I guess, is the LHEs, which is the local heat and energy strategies, are supposed to energy and efficiency strategies are supposed to come out in 2023, which is supposed to take a bit of a zoning approach. So there's a bit of a question of, especially in and around Glasgow, how can you bring the vacant and derelict land into that kind of site evaluation of where things ought to sit and what heat technology is actually right for what kind of zone within the city. So I think it's always there's so much going on, so it's sometimes a bit tricky, but it is sometimes a question of how do you bring the right kind of questions into the trajectory of some of the other policy making, which will then unlock some of your problems too.
Yep.
Thank you. Hannah, anything in the chat to contribute?
Nothing from colleagues online, but a thought from me. It strikes me that the investors in this have to be the local community. So how do they get reconnected to these projects?
Interesting. Again, there was a very deliberate reason why I invited Shona to come and answer these questions, but she's not here. No, I'll pass it to Hamish in a moment on a more general point about communities in this whole agenda. The exercise, or the piece of work that's currently underway, looking at the 263 sites in the well, actually it's not 260 because we produced a short list of the ones that are most readily directable into green and nature-based solution type opportunities. We're now looking at those with the communities along the section of the Clyde that the Clyde mission relates to identify the ones which are the most ready to move forward collaboratively and collectively. So it's exactly that process. It's to say, okay, these things are currently shape files that say this area here could be something, and it could be along these lines. There are a number of challenges to involving communities, not least the fact that the funding for vacant and derelict land from the public sector goes through the local authorities. And so one of the things that we're doing as a trusted third sector broker is try to say to communities, this is how you engage with your local authority. And more importantly, saying to local authorities, this is how you engage with your local communities. And one of the most interesting projects actually in the Clyde Mission area that's been funded this year is a community-led cycle facility in just into South Lanarkshire, which has got social enterprise businesses emerging from it and all sorts of things. And that was very much a community saying, look, this piece of land it's been a nightmare, it's been a pain for us, we've got an aspiration to do something, and there are people in our community who know what they want to do with it. How do we get the system to work with us? And I think there's quite a lot that's about joining things up, and there is a commitment to the Scottish Government to take more place-based approaches to investment, which would hopefully tie back to getting these things to stream together better, until you get an announcement that's something brand new, and then it adds to the mix, which is what we see all the time, unfortunately, from all across the world, to be honest. So yeah, I think there's a genuine need to get into localities to come up with the solutions. There's then a second brokerage role, which is how do you aggregate those up to the point where they might attract private sector investment to go alongside the public sector investment, or decide that one's public sector only and just run with it, because I think that's the other part of the mix. We have to an overall hybrid will acknowledge the fact that some things will be 100% public funded.
Just quickly, before handing over to Hamish, just to add to that, something we are exploring through the Scottish Conservation Finance Pioneers, and it's a pillar in the route map that we published last year on the first £1 billion of investment in nature in Scotland, is a nature climate bond, which is all about local people being able to invest into their green space locally. So that is another opportunity there to explore linked to vacant and derelict land. So I'll hand to Mr Hamish. Scottish Land Commission.
Thanks. Hamish Trench, Scottish Land Commission. I mean, just to pick up the communities point specifically, and Deryck's covered the wider point about the importance of actually engaging communities and the stake that communities have in this, and you saw from his presentation the potential social impact of getting these sites right. You know, this is a huge social legacy that we're dealing with here. But I think I would just there is a set of these sites that I think actually would lend themselves to community-led regeneration and development. And we've been working with the Development Trust Association of Scotland to actually put in place the support to make that happen. And actually over the last year, that support has actually, you know, led to action on 7 sites in very rapid time. And I think that's kind of proving the business case, proving the concept, if you like, that with that brokerage support, there's a set of these sites that communities can take the lead in regeneration and deliver that benefit. But I think we're also equally clear, actually, there's a whole set of these sites that are quite rightly for other entities and organisations to lead on as well, with community involvement, but led by private interests, led by public interests, and a number of these sites are of course owned within public ownership as well. So I think I would just come back to there's a real opportunity here for community-led regeneration, but this has to be a kind of Scotland-wide effort, bringing together community, corporate backing, public investment and private investment coming alongside that. And that's really the opportunity that task force identified.
The one thing I would add to that is that there's a question up there about the next one is about de-risking for private investment. Actually, there's a major element about de-risking for community empowerment as well, in the sense that I worked very closely with some communities over in Fife a couple of years ago. and they had aspirations to take on board several vacant and derelict sites around their community, but were unable to do so because of the potential risk of those sites being contaminated. Now, if they were contaminated, that's a big challenge. But checking whether they were contaminated using public funding would have actually de-risked those sites. And those communities could have said, you know what, yes, we will enter into this, we will take on that, it will be an asset, not a liability. So it's a relatively small investment that would actually have tested, literally, whether those sites were suitable. And those are the sorts of little twists and blockages that are still in the mechanism at the moment that we need to find ways to unblock them.
Thanks, Deryck. I'm going to move to our online audience. So Rory, I hope you can hear us. Any key points, particularly about the second question? I know it is a difficult question to answer, the type and scale of returns investors would seek, but also if there's any comments starting to come through about how the public sector support could be structured to de-risk private investment.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll just run through them very quickly, and I'll particularly look out for some related to scale. Firstly, around the land market, it's obviously a hot topic at the moment. Someone asked, should be incentivising or perhaps even requiring public good outcomes from purchasers of vacant and derelict land. There's a couple of models to potentially emulate. Someone references the temporary business opportunities similar to those created during the Olympic Park in London. There's another creation place based similar to the Copenhagen power plant that I believe also has a ski slope. In terms of some more specific ideas, somebody for returns, someone references a ground source for ground source heating for community use. There's vertical farming opportunity as well, which has already been mentioned. And then again, there is that sort of idea of the sort of synergistic businesses that provide multiple benefits. So circular economy benefits, for example, and that would also pave the way for natural capital investment too.
Thank you, Rory. So we've probably got about another 5 minutes left of the discussion. I would like to try and focus on that last point about public sector support helping to de-risk private investment, and as Deryck was also saying, in terms of that community involvement as well. So welcome some thoughts on that. Have we got the microphone? Yeah.
Thank you. Just in terms of de-risking, when we were in High, we did a lot of work on community energy, and one of the best products that we offered, although we can't continue to offer it, it's a bit awkward, was very small scale sums to support feasibility work and to help people plan. And to be honest, I think we probably offered out 100 or 200 grants for communities who were interested in developing energy systems, and the best outcome from that was that maybe only 10 of them passed that stage, but people were able to explore their ideas and test the feasibility without risk. And I think that when that yielded the 10 projects that could go forward, for the sake of argument, that made a huge difference to their ability to be investable. So that very micro early stage feasibility work was hugely important, recognising there will be a high failure rate, if you like, for feasibility work.
Any other comments from the floor? Hannah?
It's me again, not Zoom in the room, me as me. I think that there's a big opportunity for health boards as part of the public sector to begin to come into these projects. I've seen a number of FTech, the consultancy who kind of give a review of your landscape to say how much money you might make out of nature and how much money you might make for other social causes. And a lot of those reports say if you had therapeutic gardening opportunities, whether that's vertical farming or what's normal gardening called? Normal gardening.
Horizontal.
Thank you. Forgive me, I'm not the subject matter expert at SRUC, that's for sure. you know, those benefits would save the NHS, you know, such a great amount of money in terms of being able to offer people that treatment instead of bringing them into the health service.
Very good point. I can also see the local authorities, Ron. I don't know if you've got any representation from local authorities. It's an important role as well. Would welcome your thoughts.
Hello, I'm Daniel Zimmer from Climate Kick. I see two aspects in this de-risking this de-risking function of the public sector. There is a first part which is bring the project to investability, and so it's a sort of de-risking where you try to help also the local actors defining the value extraction mechanism, the cash flow mechanism, or other type of project development mechanism. And then there is the more financial de-risking during the project itself, which can go through guarantee mechanism, for instance. But there might be other type of instruments also to de-risk. So these two things, for me, need to be clearly distinguished. And I would even add to that, in the second phase, we have a tendency to think of risk only from financial perspectives, but in fact the risks are for all the actors, and I personally plead for a holistic de-risking approach, looking at the risk of the different actors and see how these risks are combined or interact, because it is much more than just a financial issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Rory, any final points from everyone who's joining us on Zoom?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. You just spoke to someone from the public sector. There's a couple of questions around that. Could there be a public sector guarantor who steps in if remediation of contaminated land turns out not to be possible, to de-risk the investment? I think that's quite similar to something Deryck was saying about de-risking for communities to take on potentially contaminated land. Another point in local authorities, can they put forward a package of sites where land ownership is known and aspirations for restoration are compatible? And then a final point, just again tied to local authorities, could we draw on health budgets, moving to preventative spend and nature-based therapies? And we all know the phrase of the natural health service. So that goes back once again to this idea of sort of stacking up the benefits to make it more attractive to investors.
Thank you very much, Rory, and my thanks and all our thanks to everybody who's joining us and contributing to the Miro board. Just to let everybody know that the Miro boards will be open for a number of days. In fact, I think it might be a number of weeks. So both for the Riverwoods example that we were looking at yesterday and for the vacant and derelict land. So everybody can add their thoughts to that Miro board, and we'll obviously be taking those away. And the comments, fantastic comments and conversation we've had here will be taking away as well to help us move the Riverwoods and the vacant and derelict land initiatives on. So, sorry.
Somebody's going to have to interpret those points at some point. Could I actually just say to people, your questions are as useful as your answers? So if you've got points where you say, if you mean this, why don't you say it? Or what this isn't clear enough, where should you, this is where you're going to need, that's actually going to be as helpful as somebody coming forward and saying this is a brilliant thing to go and look at. So please challenge as well as informing. That would be good.
Thank you. So I'm going to hand back over to Deryck, and I think you're going to do a summing up.
Yeah.
Over to you, Deryck.
My main summing up is, why do I always end up doing Friday afternoons? It's really not fair to any of us, but it was really just a few things about next steps. So we will use, I say today's discussions, but the discussions informed by the board in the coming weeks, we will pull together and start to use that to help us and build on some of the connections. So if anybody wants to know more or get involved, that would be really helpful. We're seeking to create a dedicated resource. The work to date has been done in the margins of other people's jobs. So it's a chance to say, like, can we get a focus here to do something more intensive? to draw in actually a lot of the thinking that's been done by the other bits of the conservation finance pioneers, because a lot of the answers to the questions we need to answer for vacant derelict land are the same questions you're asking for river woods or would be asking in any other setting. You know, how do we financially account for avoided costs? How do we get health budgets to pay for things that are not health spend? Those sorts of questions will be standard. So the aim is to use, initially at least, the Clyde mission area to begin to build an investigated portfolio of investable sites. So picking up that point about the public sector should be able to come forward with sites that are ready to use. So it's to start that process and to work with others to work out which investment models best apply to that. And effectively then to sort of move forward from there, using it as a pilot to go to somewhere beyond that. It's a mind-bogglingly complicated exercise, this, because VDL is just another one of the wicked problems add to the ones we're trying to deal with. It does have one real advantage. Those maps that I showed you about concentration means we can do something that is just in Glasgow and have a significant enough impact that it's directly transferable to everywhere else. So it doesn't have to be Scotland-wide to get to a solution. It could be Glasgow and its surrounding 7 local authorities, and we would hit probably 60% of the problem in one go. So it is possible to regionalise this discussion in a way that isn't possible for any of the other pillars. So that's my one bit of optimism against the massive deluge of problems that come with it. It's essential. We cannot have a situation where we allow land to sit for decades, not doing nothing, doing things which are negative to the local area and to the local people. So we have to get beyond that. So thank you for your time and what energy we all have on a Friday afternoon.